Greetings and welcome everyone to the American Teilhard Association's 2022 annual event. My name is Dr. Andrew Del Rossi. I'm a board member of the American Teilhard Association, and I am today's MC. We are grateful to Sister Kathleen Dignan for the opening Teilhardian montage and soundtrack. We are grateful to the board of the American Teilhard Association and for you, our guests today, for joining us as we consciously converge on the journey of cosmic and Christic emergence. As we network our neurons together in the noosphere through Zoom today, we ask you to reverence a couple of ground rules. We will mute all participants except for those speaking. When it is an appropriate time for questions, we ask that you use the chat box to ask your questions. This is the most efficient way, and then we will present those questions to the speaker. Our program today features a keynote from Dr. John Haught, followed by a question and answer session. We will then take a short break and return for a panel of young Teilhardian scholars. It is now my pleasure and an honor to introduce to you our steadfast and inspiring leader and president of the American Teilhard Association, Sister Kathleen Duffy.
So thank you very much, Andrew. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you are, we welcome you to the American Teilhard Association and to our annual event, our yearly opportunity to celebrate together the life and thought of Jesuit Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and to be inspired by his message. Today, more than ever, our world needs to hear Teilhard's voice. We must build the earth or perish, he tells us. We must create the future. We must become one. And despite the seriousness of this challenge, Teilhard's is a vision of hope for a cosmos evolving in time. His firm faith in humanity and in the God who draws us into the future supported him despite the difficulties that beset him and inspires our journey in the midst of chaos. It is heartwarming to see that so many of our members, as well as friends from our partner organizations, are with us here today. People from Canada, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and many parts of the United States. I hope I didn't miss anyone. But all of these have joined, people from all of these places have joined us for our celebration. And you are also very welcome. And a sincere thank you to those who have donated so generously to make this day possible. The American Teilhard Association was established in 1967 and throughout the years has continued to explore and to apply Teilhard's thought to the problems that beset our church and our world. For those who are not yet members, I highly recommend that you join us in our efforts. To learn how to join the American Teilhard Association, please visit our website. And Andrew will be posting the URL for our website in the chat. Our members receive paper copies of Teilhard Studies, access to online copies of Teilhard Perspective, both are published twice a year, and announcements of our online and in-person events, including our annual meeting. We will soon publicize our fall events, both on the website, on Facebook, and by way of an email to our members. Stay connected with us through Facebook and Instagram. And again, those addresses will be in the chat soon. Today, during our first hour together, our keynote speaker, Dr. John Haught, will focus on the meaning of time and will, with the help of Teilhard and Einstein, confront the scientific and theological meaning and significance of the present controversy about time. We will also save some time for a few of your questions. During the second hour, a panel of emerging Teilhard scholars will share their growing interest in and enthusiasm for Teilhard's vision. We hope that you will enjoy your time with us. And now I have the great honor of introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. John F. Haught, distinguished research professor who is now emeritus in the Department of Theology at Georgetown University. A systematic theologian, Jack has dedicated his scholarship to developing a theology appropriate for our time. Sharing Teilhard's dynamic vision of the cosmos in relation to a God whose creativity and self-giving love is drawing us into the future, Haught invites us to encounter Teilhard's God for evolution. Deeply influenced by Teilhard, as well as philosophers and theologians such as Lonergan, Polanyi, and Whitehead, Jack is the author of over 20 books, more than 100 book chapters and articles, hundreds of invited lectures and major academic presentations, as well as the recipient of several honorary degrees. Yet despite his brilliant accomplishments, Jack, like Teilhard, is a humble man, deeply concerned for issues such as ecology, the value of human life, and the meaning of suffering and death. He is a scholar who has dedicated his life to an exceptionally clear articulation of a theology that not only satisfies the mind, but also touches the heart. Today, Dr. Haught will share with us what he has learned from writing his book, God After Einstein, and compare what science tells us about time with the religious views of Teilhard and Einstein. So, Jack, we're looking forward to hearing from you and hearing about this very exciting topic. Please unmute yourself and begin.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kathy. Can everybody hear me before I begin?
Yes.
And is the screen shared with my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for that overly generous introduction, Kathy. I can't tell you and the rest of you how honored I am to be brought into this great community of hope. I was reflecting earlier today on how I identify my faith and with whom I identify my faith, and no more so than with this gathering here. So I'm indebted to all of you. Thank you, Andrew, for your introduction. Thank you, all the donors who have made this possible. Thank you to the board of advisors who have risked inviting me here again. I am so happy to be able to share a few thoughts, and some of these thoughts I have developed partway in two recent books, The Cosmic Vision of Teilhard and The God After Einstein. So what I will be doing here is just sharing with you some developments that I have made since writing these books, developing points that I made in the books, but hopefully adding something new to what I have written there. These books, one about Teilhard and one about Einstein, are in effect a kind of conversation that I have been imagining for many years that could take place or could have taken place between Teilhard and Albert Einstein. As some of you may know, they were contemporaries, so much so that they eventually, in their later years, migrated to the United States. Teilhard from France and Einstein from Germany and later Switzerland. And Teilhard was associated with the Museum of Natural History, while Einstein was associated with the Princeton Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. They both died just days apart. And what I would like to do is introduce a third figure, at least briefly, into this conversation, another contemporary who was also interested in the subject of time and God. And by bringing him in, I think it will help bring out in relief the distinctive thoughts of both Teilhard and Einstein about time. His name is Rudolf Bultmann. He's one of the top 2 or 3 most famous German theologians, Protestant theologians from the 20th century. But for the moment, we'll ask Rudolf Bultmann to retire to the green room, and we'll bring him back or allow him to come back a little bit later on, and begin with some thoughts about Teilhard and Einstein and how a conversation between the two might have gone. As you know, just to introduce them, Einstein was considered to be one of the greatest scientists of our age. And this was primarily because of his discovery of the general theory of relativity, which changed our whole understanding of the universe. And it changed it because in his thought, he did something that no one else had ever done. And that's to show the complicity, the inseparability of time from matter. Before Einstein, people had commonly thought of time as well as space as kind of containers into which God poured the content of creation. But Einstein brought the two so intimately together that if time, for some reason, ceased to exist, nature would cease to exist also. But for our purposes, the most important implication of Einstein's discovery of the intimacy of time and the cosmos is that for the first time in human history, as far as I know, it allows us to interpret the cosmos as a story. Einstein himself did not see that immediately. And that's why a conversation with Teilhard would have been very helpful in the development of Einstein's own thought. In fact, Einstein loved eternity much more than thought, so much so that his own religious life, you might say, was at bottom a kind of cult of his own experience of timelessness, an experience that he had primarily by doing geometry, which of course deals with numbers and forms, which are in principle eternal, which have always been there, which do not erode by being too closely tied to time. If you're too closely tied to time, some bad things happen, like perishing and death. And Einstein realized this, and that's why for him, the theme of timelessness was religiously so consoling and so real. So for him, as for many astrophysicists today, the numbers and the forms of mathematics and geometry are more real, in fact, than empirical reality. So because time and space are cuddled, you might say, by this environment of eternity, for Einstein, there was no need for a personal God. The timelessness of numbers given to him by geometry was enough to make him feel deeply cared for, not just intellectually, but also spiritually. So unlike Einstein, Teilhard was, of course, totally committed to the notion of a personal God. For Einstein, as we'll see, it's not necessary that God be personal. In fact, it confuses things, it messes things up, and it actually is a thorn in religion, historically, at least for Einstein, but not for Teilhard. Teilhard was much more closely and intimately tied to the reality of time. For him, time was real. And because in his early essays, he tried to do something that previous theologians had not done nearly as well, and that's to tie the idea of God intimately to the fact of time. Some of his early essays that tried to integrate geology and evolutionary biology and cosmology into his religious faith were considered too dangerous, so it was felt to be more appropriate that Teilhard spend most of his life, or a quarter of a century of his life, in China, where, of course, he developed, as we all know, a sterling scientific reputation, becoming one of the top geologists of the Asian continent. And it was while he was in China that he started writing The Human Phenomenon, a book which he was never able to get permission to have published. And he died after he came to the United States in 1955 on Easter Sunday, 8 days before Einstein. And he was pretty much, unlike Einstein, alone and unknown at the time. After he died, as we all know, he had a tremendous influence on religious thought, including shaping a lot of the ideas that were incipient, at least, at the time of the Second Vatican Council. He saw something that Einstein did not see. He saw a spiritual significance in Einstein's discoveries, especially Einstein's discoveries about nature and time that Einstein himself did not see. For Einstein, time is simply a geometric dimension. He almost geometrized the passage of time out of existence to make time a fourth dimension of his space-time universe. Whereas for Teilhard, time is much more important than that. Time is what allows the universe to be a dramatic story of awakening. And as we know, stories are the couriers of meaning. So by making the cosmos a story, it allows us to speculate on the meaning of the universe in a whole new way that previous generations of theology had not been able to do. So I'm going to play moderator, in a sense, to a conversation between these two scientific and religious giants, and ask each of them to begin by telling us what gives meaning to their lives. And Einstein would reply immediately, without hesitation, what gives meaning and happiness and joy and zest to his own life is the rapturous amazement he feels, he experiences at the harmony of natural law, which lies behind appearances and which reveals an intelligence, not a personal intelligence, but an intelligence of such superiority that compared with it, all the systematic thinking and acting of human beings is an utterly insignificant reflection. It is beyond question, this rapturous amazement, closely akin, he says, to that which has possessed the religious geniuses of all ages. So he would be deeply insulted by any accusation that he's not a deeply religious thinker. Teilhard would respond like this. This is one of only many ways he would respond. The only thing that keeps me youthful, he says, and active, what gives zest to his life, you might say, is the growing belief he had that there is something immense, something beautiful that's going to take place throughout the world up ahead in the future. And that to find happiness, true happiness, to meet true meaning, we must abandon ourselves to this mighty current that has been existing and playing itself out long before any of us came along. This mighty current of development of the universe becoming more. So to sum up the spiritual life as it is understood by each of these great thinkers, for Einstein, the spiritual life amounts to allowing yourself to be carried out of time and into the timeless mystery of the universe's comprehensibility, a comprehensibility which for Einstein was purely geometric. Whereas for Teilhard, the spiritual life consists of being carried forward by time into the immensity and beauty of what is not yet, of what is coming, to cultivate a sense of our belonging as a community of hope to a universe that is still largely not yet, but which is still coming into being. So quite a difference in the conception of a spiritual life. Well, as Einstein is listening to Teilhard, here are the thoughts that occur to him. The universe, as he understands it, is already complete. It is not coming into being at all. It already is. Matter is forever, he was inclined to think, and the laws which shape matter are eternal, are inviolable. And since the laws that shape the universe are inviolable, even if matter does change locally, it's the laws that give to the universe its reality, its beauty, and hence its identity. So for him, for Einstein, there's no real increase that's going on in the cosmos, in cosmic being. There's no more dimension. There's no not yet that is attracting the universe. It's already there. And the timeless science or math of geometry is enough to reveal the beauty. If we practice geometry correctly, and he struggled to do so and was not always successful, but if we practice geometry successfully, we will be impressed. We will be smacked in the face by the beauty of the real universe that underlies appearances. This Einstein saw as a truly religious disposition. Sometimes people would ask him, do you believe in God? And his answer would always be something like, I believe in Spinoza's God. Spinoza, as we all know, is the author of the modern doctrine of pantheism, which has always been a tendency or temptation in religion. Pantheism is the belief that all is God. And that means for Spinoza, and later for Einstein, that God and nature are the same. They're just two names for all that is. So there's nothing that transcends nature. There's no goal toward which nature is being called. God and nature are two names for all that is. And since God has been thought of in classical theology as eternal and necessary, what that means now, if you're a pantheist, is that nature is eternal and necessary. And that would imply logically that there's no room for anything that resembles freedom or indeterminacy, and there's no room for necessity in the universe as Teilhard has understood it. But the universe itself is necessary and eternal, and that's enough. And it's consolation and enough religiously that we would cozy up as much as we can to the eternity and necessity. It would also mean that nature, as science, according to Einstein, assumes, is a closed continuum of cause and effect relationships reflecting laws that are indestructible, inviolable, and unchanging. To this point that Einstein is emphasizing here, Teilhard would say, your own equations of general relativity, if you look at them in a certain way, allow that the universe is not eternal and necessary, that it's not standing still. And to back up this point, Teilhard would invoke his fellow Catholic priest and probably one of the greatest mathematical physicists of the 20th century, Georges Lemaitre in Belgium, who right after Einstein had published the theory of general relativity in 1916, studied them and concluded that a good interpretation of this mathematics is that the cosmos began long ago as a primeval atom, and ever since that time has been expanding. So that makes Lemaitre, much more than Einstein perhaps, the father of the Big Bang theory of the universe. And what Lemaitre was able to produce, and Einstein was not, was actual concrete evidence of the expansion of the universe. An expansion that had been recorded by Edwin Hubble and his staff at the Mount Wilson Observatory in California. They had observed that the light emitted by some massive objects, which later turned out to be galaxies, we didn't know about galaxies until the 20th century, that the light from those massive bodies, some of them, shifts toward the red end of the spectrum, which means that the light waves coming from that body are elongated or stretched out. And that would mean that these bodies are moving away at an exceedingly rapid pace from one another. So that if the universe is still expanding, as the evidence shows it to be, then the galaxies are distributed very far apart now because they've been around for a long time. So that if we go back in time several billion years, we would find that the galaxies are much closer together. And if we go all the way back in time to t equals 0, we would find the whole shebang compressed into a tiny pinprick of matter smaller than the nucleus of an atom, which then burst out into what we call the expanding Big Bang universe. This thought has also caused many scientists and a few theologians to speculate that if the universe began, and since everything that begins to exist can only exist because of something that exists already before it, then do we not have smoking gun evidence of the moment of divine creation? Now, there's a lot of thought, many books and many articles, and much thought and teaching has been based upon this thought. But Teilhard, interestingly enough, was not, as I can tell, as I see it, was not terribly interested in the question of cosmic origins. He always thought, and you see this in the human phenomenon, that grasping origins is a very slippery business, and it's never very precise. But what we can know for sure is that the universe that we exist in is expanding. And that means it's still coming into being. And he sometimes used the term unfinished universe, or he would say the universe is a borning. And what that meant for him is if it's still coming into being, then that opens up the future of the universe in a way that has never happened before. So in that respect, he was deeply indebted to both Einstein and Lemaitre for this sense that the cosmos is a story that is still going on, still coming into being. And he thought, and he wrote this down many times in many ways, that all of us, scientist or believer, have to get into our heads the fact that the universe we live in is not finished. It's still incomplete. It's still coming into being. Hence, it has a future, and hence there is reason for hope that we never had before in modern science. But instead of waiting for geometric coherence, which was satisfactory enough for Einstein, Teilhard, if I could put words into his mouth, was looking at the universe in such a way as to expect something like a narrative coherence, the way stories come together, but only if you wait for the story to happen. We might use the analogy of how we approach reading a novel or attending a play or watching a movie. If we stop reading the Brothers Karamazov after the first 15 chapters, we don't know what it's all about. We have to be patient. We have to follow it to the end. Likewise, I think Teilhard suspected that the universe, if it's a story still unfolding, is such that we really can't understand it. And we should not be too impatient to say that the universe is absurd or the universe is fully complete. We must be patient. Patience and waiting, you might say, philosophically speaking, are epistemological necessities, preconditions for getting to know the universe that we're in. So we can't know the universe without taking on the disposition of hope. Eventually, Einstein, like doubting Thomas, bowed down and accepted the evidence coming from Hubble and the interpretation given to it by Lemaitre, whom Einstein at one time had thought of as a kind of clown, but who eventually turned out to be the one who had a better handle of the cosmos than Einstein. So let's look briefly at a closer comparison then of Einstein's understanding of time and some other features of human thought and practice with those of Teilhard. For Einstein, time's passage, our sense that time moves from past through present and through future, As Lee Smolin, a contemporary great physicist, has pointed out, Einstein thought of time's passage as a kind of illusion. Carlos Rovelli and others have pointed out that for Einstein, time was more of a psychological phenomenon than something that pertains to the cosmos itself. Whereas for Teilhard, time is concretely real. There really is a transition from past through present to future, even though many, many theoretical physicists still would line themselves up with Einstein rather than with Teilhard on this point. And that would mean that the universe is unfinished, that there's still room for a new future up ahead for Teilhard. Einstein, however, considered himself just as much a man of faith, a person of faith, as Teilhard, except that for Einstein, his faith consists in a trust that you surrender, by which you surrender yourself to the timeless mystery of geometric coherence, not narrative coherence, but geometric coherence that lies beneath appearances. Whereas for Teilhard, faith, the life of faith, including his Christian faith, has to involve a sense that the narrative coherence of the cosmic story lies up ahead, and for which we have to wait, not passively, as we'll see, but actively by participating in this journey. For Einstein, accordingly, the moral life, the good life, the ethical life, consists of aligning yourself, as he tried to do in his own life, with what he considered to be eternal and unchangeable. And that included not only what he detected geometrically, but also superpersonal values such as truth and beauty, which he detected underneath of all ephemeral, evanescent appearances of things. Align yourself with that. Then you'll be a consistent person. You'll be a reliable and faithful friend, for example. Without denying any of that, Teilhard would say that moral life also consists of contributing whatever we can to the ongoing adventure of a cosmic awakening. The creation consists of an ongoing awakening, an awakening to the transcendent, to God, to meaning, to truth, to goodness, to beauty as well. But it has to take on flesh in time. It's not something that can be done abstractly without action that corresponds. We need to give flesh in our journeys in time to the eternal ideals that we emulate. Happiness. For Einstein, happiness consists of this ecstatic communion that he himself felt with the dimension of timelessness. I can picture Einstein going into his study as often as every day he could, closing the door behind him and communing in a way, or bathing himself in a world of numbers and forms. And that gave him a sense of belonging to eternity. And it gave him not only intellectual satisfaction, but deep spiritual satisfaction to have been able to approximate this world beneath appearances, this world of timelessness. And as I reflect on this, it seems that kind of spirituality is much closer to what has passed as Christian spirituality throughout the ages. How much has Christian spirituality, since almost the beginning, understood the spiritual life, the Christian life, as one of leaving time behind, of sort of suppressing the notion of divine incarnation and tying yourself as closely as you can to what is timeless. And that means that what Einstein has wrought, at least by implication in his cosmology, should have an enormous transformative effect on Christian theology, an effect which I'm sorry to say has just barely begun. And what makes Teilhard so important is that he gives us another understanding of happiness, that happiness now, at least in the present, It's not necessarily feeling that you have been completely united with eternity, but happiness consists of your sense that the universe you live in time, is capable of becoming more. And it's only because the reality we live in is capable of becoming more that hope is possible. This is a point that the Protestant theologian Jürgen Moltmann also makes. Only if reality is going somewhere can we really love others, because love means opening up a new future for others. But if reality has no room for a real future, then according to Teilhard, this stunts the pathway, the morality, the ethic of love, as it does for Moltmann as well. And it's this sense of becoming more that gives Teilhard what he calls his zest for living. And it's only, he thinks, only if you have this zest for living can you develop a really robust moral sense as well. So you can see how different these thinkers are, even they're using the same concepts of eternity and time. What is the way to happiness? For Einstein, it's participation in the timeless world of geometry. For Teilhard, it's a great hope held in common with others, with a community like the one we have gathered here today. In his wonderful essay on happiness, which I recommend if you've never read it, it's well worth reading. Happiness consists of 3 stages. First, develop yourself as part of this universe becoming more. But then at a certain point, without stopping self-development, join up in communion with others. So first be, second love, and then join with others in a common worship, which for Teilhard, as I understand it, means allowing yourself to be taken up into this still awakening universe, into deeper and deeper communion with that to which the universe is awakening. For Einstein, once again, the universe that is really at bottom in eternity, a timelessness, there's no need for a personal God. You're already cared for. You're already in the arms of this timelessness that geometry has led you to. That's enough to fill your life. Whereas for Teilhard, from a certain point of view, what the universe story is all about, more than anything else, is the outcome that we call the person. We cannot understand or appreciate or value what a person is without seeing the story passing through deep time of millions and millions of years in order to recently bring about what we call the person. So to those who think that Teilhard somehow depersonalizes us, just the opposite. At one time he said, if you want a soul or a person, first you have to create a universe. So the way in which he's aligned our own life and our quest for meaning and happiness with deep time is unprecedented, I think. The philosopher Henri Bergson also had an appreciation of time as duration, and he got into many arguments with Einstein before Teilhard came into the conversation at all. But even Bergson did not have the sense of the future that Teilhard does, of an open future. Einstein also, after hearing this, says that he would object to the idea of a personal God, mostly because it would interrupt the laws of nature. To be known as such, a personal God, a God who cares, a providential God, would have to be known, would have to interrupt the smooth flow of nature. And science simply cannot allow that to happen. Science is based upon predictions. It's based upon the idea that nature is a closed continuum. So anything that would resemble divine action would be a rupture, would be a break in the very foundation of what science has to believe in order to be a reliable discipline. A responsive God, a God who cares and responds to our prayers, if there were such a reality, it would mean the end of science. So there's no point to prayer. By praying, we are denying the truth and the foundational establishment of science, which is the assumption of an uninterrupted universe. Einstein would probably agree with the sarcastic definition of prayer by the American satirist Ambrose Bierce, who in his Devil's Dictionary defines prayer as asking that the laws of the universe be annulled in behalf of a single petitioner, confessedly unworthy. So for people like Einstein and for many scientists today, the very fact of prayer is an insult to scientists. So clearly Teilhard has to come up with a better understanding of prayer than this. Einstein, however, would want to continue, not only is prayer, not only is the idea of an acting God impossible to reconcile with science, but so also is the common belief in human freedom. If there were such a thing as human freedom, it too would violate the assumptions, the deterministic assumptions of modern science, that nature cannot be interfered with, that there's no interruption possible. If freedom exists, then science is wrong. And this is why Einstein says, I do not at all believe in human freedom in the philosophical sense. Everybody acts not only under external compulsion, but also in accordance with inner necessity. The physical characteristics that underlie mind and our deceptive sense of free choice, all that is really, as science has discovered, an unbroken deterministic continuum into which freedom cannot enter as an integral part. Everything, including human thought, human life, is determined by forces over which we have no control. We all dance to a mysterious tune, intoned in the distance by an invisible piper. This is why it's so interesting to me that Einstein, during and after the Second World War, after he had become famous, was invited to give many lectures around the world. And in many of them, he would exhort his audience to get rid of anything that smacks of authoritarianism or Nazism or dominance in the political and social world. And he would tell people that they had to exercise their responsibility in resisting Hitler and the rise of Nazism. And so it's been hard, as many other people have pointed out, to reconcile Einstein's denial of human freedom on the one hand with what in practice he was urging people to exercise in his real life, in his real encounter with people. And as far as I was able to tell, and when I wrote God After Einstein, I was never able to find any place where Einstein recognized this contradiction or attempted to address it. In addition to a personal God, and in addition to freedom, another doctrine, especially dear to Christians, the doctrine of resurrection, that life can happen after death, or that Jesus rose from the dead, would also be a violation of the scientific worldview. Resurrection would be just as much an interruption of the continuum that science relies its intellectual stature on, as would the doctrines of freedom or divine action. The timeless geometry of space-time, along with the laws of physics, Einstein would insist, rule out any exceptions. So Christianity does not make sense in light of what science has discovered. The universe, again, Einstein would say, is run well enough by the aimless and always faithful, impersonal, reliable laws of science. And that should be enough for all of us in our quest for something reliable on which to base our lives. Well, at this point, Rudolf Bultmann, who's been attending to this conversation so far, could not contain himself anymore. And so he comes onto the scene, he comes into the conversation and insists that contemporary Christian theology can be construed, can be constructed in such a way that the notion or belief in a personal God, in human freedom, and in the doctrine of resurrection can be understood without in any way violating the deterministic laws of nature that Einstein has made the basic worldview of his own vision of religion. All you have to do, Bultmann would say, is recognize that there are two realms of being, there are two worlds, and science can know nothing about it. That's why it says nothing about the world of freedom. We humans exist between two worlds. We are, yes, part of nature, but we are also just as much, and we should become in the course of our lives, and this is the ethical demand we have, we should learn to how to liberate ourselves, because at heart we are free from the determinism of the natural world. So keep these two worlds apart, and you'll be able to make sense of the fundamental religious doctrines of divine action and resurrection and human freedom. And that means that we theologians, Bultmann would say, should accept the acceptable scientific view of the world, which is that of Einstein, accept Einstein's view of nature, accept the view that nature itself is a closed continuum of cause and effect relationships, which cannot be broken by ourselves or by God, and which is not disturbed in any way by the coming of the gospel into the human experience. There is no room, Einstein would agree, Bultmann would agree with Einstein, there is no room for freedom in nature. So the scientist can perfectly well become a Christian, provided he or she separates the world of nature from the world of freedom, which we know intuitively and immediately. God's love, Bultmann would agree, does not work by interrupting any laws of nature. When we read the Gospels, when we read about the great mighty acts of God, we should look for their deeper meaning and not take them as natural curiosities or as breaking any laws of nature. And that includes the resurrection narratives. We can make sense of these three doctrines: divine action, human freedom, and resurrection, if we go over to the world of freedom and recognize that these things happen not in nature, but in the deep private subjectivity of each person endowed by definition with freedom. This is where God lives. This is where we encounter God in a way that's completely hidden from science. So there should be no competition, no conflict between Christian thought, Christian practice, Christian faith on the one hand, and science on the other. It's a false problem, which can be solved if we just make these distinctions between nature and freedom. Freedom is the arena where faith encounters the liberating word of the gospel. So when you read the gospels, interpret them as the challenge of a personal God, for you no longer to define yourself in terms of what you've done in the past or in terms of how science defines you. No, define yourself in terms of your private, incommunicable, ecstatic enjoyment or experience of the divine call to freedom. This is where resurrection in the true sense occurs. And the form that resurrection really takes in each of us is a form called faith. And Bultmann, a devout Lutheran, wanted to separate faith from works And one of the works he wanted to separate faith from was the work of scientists to determine us or to box us in to some mechanistic set of engineering by divine creator. Faith is the only miracle worth talking about. Anyways, it's a miracle by which, after having lived in sin, which means inauthentic existence, and denying our freedom, denying our dignity, we are transformed to a life in Christ as worthy of salvation, of liberation, into the realm of freedom, another name for which is God. So in that way, Bultmann thought, and modern theology has, modern Christian theology has followed him, maybe not into the extremes that he's going, but in general, modern theology, Christian theology, has divorced faith from the natural world. I don't have time to go into all the ecological implications of that divorce, but it's something we have to recognize that's almost indigenous to modern Christian theology. Well, Teilhard has been bursting to protest. If you want to make Christianity intelligible to scientifically educated people, how could you leave out Charles Darwin and what Darwin has taught us about ourselves as well as about nature? After Darwin, and after Einstein too, for that matter, we can't separate ourselves plausibly from the rest of nature and the passage of time. We exist in real time. And it's because real time is always open to what is new that freedom can exist. Freedom is not part of the mechanistic understanding of nature, but freedom can be part of a universe that is awakening to the divine. Our freedom is just as much part of nature as rocks and rivers, and we misunderstand nature. This was the whole point of the phenomenon of man, or the human phenomenon. We misunderstand the natural world, misunderstand the universe, if we fail to notice that it has been awakening to freedom, to new life, to God from the very start. This God to which the universe is awakening is not an interference with nature, but a fulfillment of nature. Whereas Bultmann's theology, as Teilhard would see it, is just another way of escaping from time, as so much Christian theology has done. So to reconcile science with faith, we don't need to accept Einstein's mechanistic understanding of the natural world. We need a whole new understanding, not only of time, but of the universe. And we should seek salvation not by escaping from time, but by hoping for the fulfillment of time and placing ourselves at the juncture where the universe is awakening more and more to the horizon of the divine which comes to us on the wings of the future. So just to conclude and summarize in a way, what is the meaning of time then for Teilhard? I think he would agree in a sense with what modern physicists are saying, that time is what keeps everything from happening at once. A definition which is probably much deeper than it sounds. But if I could interpret Teilhard's thought, these are not his own words, this is my own interpretation of how he would engage in this conversation with Bultmann and Tillich. Time, I think he would agree, is what happens when the arrival of the future causes the present to move into the fixity of the past. So the great agency and power, what powers the universe's journey, its awakening, is the arrival of the future. This is not something that you would find in scientific textbooks. But if you look more broadly and empirically at time, and especially as how we experience time and how we experience happiness and how we are attracted to the newness and the moreness that's coming into the universe, then maybe in this wider empiricism, there's room for a new view of nature, one that you won't find in scientific textbooks. So look for God, freedom, and resurrection, not as Bultmann and Einstein are inclined to do, as breaches in the fixity of the past, especially Bultmann, but look for God where the world is awakening to the divine, to freedom, resurrection. Moreover, Teilhard would caution, look for these realities, these greatest of all realities, which grasp us much more than we grasp them. Look for them not in some timeless sphere outside of nature, which much Christian theology has been inclined to do, but look for them at the juncture where the whole cosmic journey is still awakening to the future on which it rests. Thank you. My time has run out.
Thank you so much, Jack. That was a phenomenally rich presentation, gave us a whole lot to think about, and we already see the questions coming into the chat box now. Our first comes from Richard Jordan, who asks, what might Einstein and Teilhard have said about the use of the term Anthropocene?
What would Einstein have said about it? Einstein would not have noticed it because
the question was Einstein and Teilhard.
Okay. Well, first of all, Einstein did not see the changes that take place in time as having the stature that Teilhard did. And this is partly because Einstein, ironically enough, was still tied to the classical understanding of God as eternity and necessity. He would have agreed with the early Christian heretics who denied, by way of the heresies of Docetism and Arianism and Nestorianism and pantheism, who would have denied that God can get too close to time. And the reason for that is understandable too. If God gets too closely tied up with time, then will not the very consoling features that we associate with the eternity of God be lost? And should we not take pains to preserve the eternity of God? And shouldn't we construct our Christologies in such a way as to emphasize that Christ did not really get too close to time? And this is what the doctrine of Docetism had implied. So in that sense, Einstein would be closer to the heretics. So when you come to the Anthropocene, which is a name that's especially dear to the hearts of people who've developed an ecological perspective, Einstein would hardly have noticed, nor would, to be fair about it, most Christian theology. And that's why it's been such a torturous thing for Christianity to develop a robust ecological theology and ethic. In order to do so, it had to go back to the early Christological councils. It had to accept Chalcedon, it had to accept Nicaea, and their doctrine that God cozies up to time. God loves time, so why should we not? And then think of divine indestructibility not as something outside of time, but something that accumulates and adds more to it as the universe moves toward its future. So there's room for a hope that stays close to the ground, that stays close to time. And so that kind of theology would be much more open to recognizing the Anthropocene and sensitive to the way in which theology has sort of extracted us from nature rather than seen us as a development, as an outcome of this great cosmic awakening that we call the universe. There's more to it than that, of course, but those are some thoughts that occur to me.
Thank you, Jack. I once heard a farmer say that you give a compost pile a long enough amount of time and it will show you that resurrection is a fundamental property of nature. So
yeah. Yes, I think Thomas Aquinas said something like that.
That's right. Yeah. So we have another question coming in here from Anne-Marie Dalton, and she asks, as someone who places freedom and hope in the flesh of history, Does the present flesh of the world support Teilhard's hopeful vision?
Well, Teilhard himself admitted many times, if you look at the present, apart from any hope for the future, it's not very promising. And this is why the more I've studied Teilhard, the more I think that what underlies his thought maybe more deeply than he himself would have said, since he was not into metaphysics, not metaphysical vision, because for him metaphysics meant the kind of metaphysics he picked up as a scholastic, the metaphysics of being rather than of becoming. As I've emphasized in my two recent books, more than ever before, I think Teilhard and I think theology now has to follow him here. Basis is thought on what I call a metaphysics of the future, that the really real world lies up ahead. The really real world is not the one that we hear about every day, that we watch going on in Ukraine and in the endemic and in the terrorism and so forth. That's not, at least that's not the whole picture. The difference between Teilhard and Einstein on that is that Einstein wanted the whole picture to be present immediately. So his thought was a product of what I call impatience. He wanted the full meaning of things to be there already. But for him to believe that, he had to deny almost the reality of what's going on in time. And at times it seemed he did. To me, it seems at times he was very unrealistic about facing up with the real problems going on in the world. But the other extreme is to make that the only real world. This is the cosmic pessimist approach. And that approach is based on what I call metaphysics of the past. Metaphysics of the past says that the universe was virtually completed back in the beginning, in the massive sea of pre-atomic particles out of which the whole thing developed. That was the real world for the cosmic pessimist. And everything that's happened since is simply a reshuffling, an insignificant and evanescent reshuffling of the lifeless world that was there in the beginning. That philosophy, and it's dominant, I think, in the intellectual and academic world today, is this metaphysics of the past, is thought of by most intellectuals as the most realistic picture that we could have. And if that's the most realistic picture of the universe, of reality that we could have, then everything religious, everything poetic, everything that puts us in touch with beauty is ephemeral, is just fickle, is just illusory. And that's why in modern times, it's been so easy to think of poetry and art and music and religion as sheer illusions that we humans project out onto what is really a closed and dead and lifeless universe as it's been discovered by modern atomistic science. So atomism, Teilhard called this the analytical illusion. The analytical illusion, which is dominant in intellectual circles today, is the view that says if you want to understand the present, keep going back, back, and back, tracing the series of causes back to the primordial soup from which it all began. And somehow that doctrine maintains that the really real world is not the world of life and thought and faith. Whereas for Teilhard, the real world is one that's awaiting and the one that's awakening through the outcomes that we call life and then thought and then faith. This is what Teilhard meant when he said what the universe needs now. He called it the earth. The earth is metonymy for the universe in Teilhard's thought. What the universe needs now is faith and more faith and ever more faith. Why? Because it's only through faith that we let into the present the arrival of the future, the arrival of real being, of more being from the future. So that's the metaphysical framework that I think we have to have to answer Anne-Marie's very good question. And this is only, as Anne-Marie knows, this is only part of the answer.
Thank you, John. We have another question here, somewhat similar on that notion of now. It comes from Jason Willits, and he writes, "It feels to me like there is always and only now, capital now, a chirological perspective," so operating in that notion of kairos. "We assume a chronological perspective. While I await God coming to me from a future I have yet to experience, what would you say to someone allowing the now to be the all?"
Excellent question. And I do try to respond to that in my books. And I don't know whether this is a good response or not, but it's one that I learned less from Teilhard than from the theologian of hope, Jürgen Moltmann, whose book, Theology of Hope, I began reading at the same time that I started years ago when I was in my 20s studying Teilhard. And one of the objections that people raise to a theology or a practice of hope is that it robs the present of the depth and of the happiness that we should be experiencing in the now. And Moltmann's answer to that, and I think it's implicit in Teilhard, is that it doesn't rob you of the happiness of the present, because the happiness of the present in a Teilhardian universe is hope, is anticipation. If you see what I mean, it's that swelling of our hearts that occurs when we realize that the future we hope for is not yet here, but there is a not yet. And that opens up the present to a horizon of depth and beauty that is not yet here, but which can sweep us into itself. Whereas if you deny the reality of the realistic quality of hope, you're very likely not to have that kind of happiness that Teilhard and Moltmann are talking about, namely anticipation itself. And it's not till anticipation has been brought fully into communion with what is anticipated that you can have realistically the ecstatic kind of happiness that we want in our impatience to be part of our present life as well.
Phenomenal answer. Thank you, John. So next, we just have a comment here I think is interesting to read, and I would encourage everyone to scroll through the chat just to see some of these questions and comments that I'm not getting to. But Richard Page says that Rudolf Steiner, who I believe is regarded as a kind of mystic, held that Golgotha was the turning point where matter began its return to spirit. Perhaps a lot to unpack there, but interesting thought.
Well, yeah. I think that in light of Einstein, in light of evolution, in light of geology, and the sense of a universe that's still coming into being, the transformation that we used to talk about took place in an immobile, hierarchically structured, static universe where matter was down here, and then there's life, and then there's spirit in various forms at higher levels. So it was a transformation that de facto had to require our abandonment of the lower levels. If you read, for example, St. Bonaventure's Itinerarium Mentis, the Journey into God, if you read that, you'll find that in a medieval pre-scientific context, we had to, in order to feel alive, we had to experience the sense of being transformed. Transformation has always been a necessity for deeper happiness. It was understandable that you would understand this transformation as a kind of abandonment of the material or physical realm, so as to come closer to the higher forms of life and mind, and eventually communion with God. And this vision, a static vertical vision, still gives meaning to the lives of millions and millions of people. And that was the form, as Teilhard would call it, of traditional Catholicism as well. So I think when the conversation we had between Bultmann and Einstein and Teilhard were to continue, after that last slide that I showed, I think both Einstein and Bultmann would say, this doesn't sound very Catholic at all, this vision that you're proposing here. Because the Catholic form, the form that Catholicism has been unfurled in or developed in, is that of the static, vertical, hierarchical universe. But what Teilhard would say in response to them, I don't have the whole quote here, is that Catholicism is always packaged in the form of a particular epoch. But that doesn't mean that this particular form belongs to the deposit of faith. What belongs more to the deposit of faith is hope. And if hope means transformation of the universe, then theology should emphasize that in a way that it was never able to do so in the past. So there's this debate that's going to go on a long time between two types of Catholicism, one based upon the medieval hierarchical static view, and the other one that is more Abrahamic and that thinks of God as calling not only us, not only Israel, and not only the people of faith, but calling the whole cosmos into a new future. That's the form in which transformation can take place. And that requires just as much personal commitment to values as the traditional view did, if not more.
Thank you. And I think we have time for about one more question here. Therese Birch writes, can prophets be understood as revealing what has happened in time rather than predicting what is to come in the future?
Excellent point. Paul Tillich, when he discussed what a prophet is and why a prophet is rejected in his time or his own time, is someone who is in touch with the depth of existence, with the depth of reality, with God, in other words. And that depth always is deeper than any present age. And so the prophet will inevitably be rejected, sometimes persecuted, sometimes killed by the present age. We can think of many, many examples of that. What Teilhard does is sort of turn Tillich on its side. And he would say that let me just this was going to be my next slide anyway. Where Tillich would talk about the name of the infinite and inexhaustible depth that underlies things is God. Teilhard would say the name of the infinite and inexhaustible future to which the world is awakening is God. This always faithful and renewing future is what the word God means. And if that word, and here I'm paraphrasing or adapting Tillich's theological discourse here, and if that word, future, has not much meaning for you, translate it and speak of what you hope for in your communion of fellow beings, for what you hope for with all your heart and soul. Teilhard translates this into not just what our heart and soul wants, but into what the universe is looking for. And that includes us, but it also includes much else that needs a future as well. Perhaps in order to make this change, you must go beyond the classical, analogical, hierarchical vision that has shaped spiritual life thus far, especially in Christianity. No longer think of your personal destiny separately as a departure from the universe, separately from that of the whole cosmic journey into God. From now on, do not think of your own personal transformation or destiny apart from the transformation or destiny of the whole universe. This, I think, is what Teilhard's thought implies, that this is its challenge today.
Jack, thank you very much for your time, your presentation, for entertaining and answering these questions. It's certainly been enriching and a lot for us to dive into and continue to unpack here. We look forward to diving into your book as well, which people can access. And at this point now, we are going to switch back to Sister Kathy here right before we take our break.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Jack. You certainly have stretched our thoughts about time and eternity. I'm particularly grateful because I have 2 reading circles that are just beginning to delve into your book, and I'm sure and a lot of the members are here, so I'm sure they've picked up a lot of pointers that'll make our reading flow more graciously. So thank you again.
All right, and here we are back, everyone. Welcome back. At this point, I am going to be grabbing in the spotlight, or if my admins could be helping me, that would be much appreciated, to spotlight our emerging Teilhardian scholars. All right, there we all are. Good to see you. I am going to jump on here to be with you myself. And I'm just going to go through and I'm going to give a brief intro for each of our emerging Teilhardians here. And then they will pick up the ball and they will continue to share about their inspiration and their work. That is all within the spirit of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. So first, we will begin with Sister Celia Ashton, who is a graduate of St. Joseph's University. Sister Celia was practicing as a dentist for 10 years before she entered the Carmelite Sisters of Baltimore. And now she works with prayer as a way for transformation, healing, and societal change. Sister Celia is currently, as of this January, working on her master's in theological studies at Villanova, where she hopes to work with another Teilhardian scholar, Sister Elia Delio. So, Celia, thank you so much for being on our panel today, and we look forward to hearing about your work.
Thanks for having me with you.
For sure. So, Celia, why don't you go ahead and share us a little bit about your work, and then we'll go on to the next person and we'll introduce them next.
Okay. The life and writings of Teilhard de Chardin have captivated my imagination and inflamed my passion and my desire for God. In Teilhard, I have found a fellow traveler and a companion who delights in the wonder and beauty of creation, and who allowed himself to be absorbed by the God who courses through every blade of grass, glides on the back of every soaring bird, dances in each sparkling ray of light, bursts forth in every blossoming flower, and enlivens all matter, even the most inanimate object, with spirit. Teilhard has helped me to see the luminosity of God radiating from the Sacred Heart into the farthest corners and deepest recesses of the cosmos, weaving a network of intricate fibers which carry the pulsating love of God into each human heart. Moved by the magnetism of God, Teilhard charted a pathway to transformation and communion that resonates with me, one that I hope to spend a lifetime exploring. Teilhard has helped me to leave the mythical Garden of Eden and relish in the dynamism of the unfolding universe, which is continually in the process of becoming. This unfinished and expanding universe is being lured into its future by the cosmic Christ, who embraces all in love. This is who excites and energizes me, this God of evolution's future. Like Teilhard, I want to harness for God the energies of love and to become love at the heart of the universe through grace participation in the divine life. As Carmelites, when we enter the novitiate, we take a title, a name of God that is significant for us. Inspired by Teilhard, I chose the Cosmic Christ. In choosing this title, I wanted to express the interconnectedness of every living being, including the earth and the entire cosmos, an interconnectedness that in and through the living Christ leads to a profound communion and a transformation of consciousness that carries with it the possibility of true liberation, a liberation from the individualistic, small self that lives in competition with the whole and moves us into the realm of the deeply personal self who shares consciousness with the whole, the ultra-human. Teilhard's conceptualization of the noosphere has been incredibly significant for me, and my understanding of it deepened throughout the pandemic when we relied on various technologies such as Zoom to connect us in a new way. This sphere of human consciousness enveloping the world became so evident to me as our community shared prayer over Zoom with people throughout the world. I couldn't help but feel that through these virtual connections, we were engaging the dynamism of the noosphere and were pressing into the realm of the ultra-human. We weren't just individuals in little boxes on the screen. Much like Teilhard's vision of the picture he describes in Christ in the world of matter, the sharp demarcations of each box began to merge. And I could sense that the energy flowing between each person was not only animating each of us, it was affecting the consciousness of every particle of matter that separated us across the miles that separated us, enmeshing us into the depths of God's love, a force which unites and compels us to lean into the collective we for the sake of the transformation of the world and the future of humanity. Shortly before the pandemic, Sister Liz Sweeney, SSJ, introduced our community to We Space Dialogue, a contemplative practice where we shift our attention from the I to the we, and we lean into what is emerging between us. Our community continued this practice over Zoom throughout the pandemic, and I have come to see it as a vital part of our becoming pioneers of this evolutionary future. For many of us, the language of emergence is new. The shift in focus from what we have done to whom we are becoming leaves us with new questions, opens us to new possibilities and new conversations, and is sure to bring new challenges. However, as Teilhard indicated, the next step on this evolutionary journey is for us to do our part to usher in a new consciousness of shared being and to transcend the boundaries that have traditionally defined us. As is evident each time I turn on the news, we are a people on the way, living in an unfinished universe. While the work of an evolutionary God moves us onto the edge of chaos, it also allures us into the future with a sense of wonder, an element of surprise, and abundant hope. As I encounter the pain of the world, I am tempted to despair. The image that comes to mind is that of individual particles repelling, colliding, destroying, bursting into flames. And I wonder, what is the threshold whereby these repelling particles will begin to unite? This question leads me to the hope I feel Teilhard holds out to us in 2022. The conviction that by continuing to put love on the currents of human consciousness and allowing ourselves to be woven into the fabric of the noosphere, we will reach a critical mass whereby the energy of love will impel us to live from a place of communion and wholeness. Confident of this, I join Teilhard and all of you in offering to God the labors and sufferings of the world this day. Thank you.
Thank you, Celia. And next we will move to Dr. Joshua Canzona, who is an Budman University scholar. His research and teaching are focused on religious literacy, comparative theology, and Muslim-Christian dialogue with specialties in mysticism, religion and science, and religion and art. Currently, he offers workshops and individual coaching on effective communication strategies and conflict resolution at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So, Josh, if you would please take the floor and share a little bit about Teilhard's influence in your work.
Sure. Thank you, Andrew. That was beautiful, Celia. My fear of the dentist has diminished slightly, so I didn't know that was possible. Yeah, in addition to my work teaching and doing comparative or interreligious theology, my primary employment is as a university ombudsman. So I work to help people navigate challenges and conflicts on campus. So in broad terms, I work in the field of conflict resolution or conflict transformation. In plain terms, I help people who might not otherwise talk with each other find a way to communicate productively. I help individuals who work together to actually work together with some recognition of their common mission and interests. So for me in this work, Teilhard is the great prophet of movement toward unity. And one of his early wartime essays, he writes, true growth is effected in progress toward unity. And we have also the passionate cry from the hymn of the universe, a desire, irresistible hallowing, Lord, make us one. So in my work, I often use the following definition of conflict as a grounded and practical instrument. It reads, conflict is, quote, a perceived divergence of interest or a belief that the party's current aspirations cannot be achieved simultaneously. And so there are words there that provide opportunity for movement. There's words there that are optimistic or give one some hope in a conflict situation, whether it's small or immense. The divergence of interest is perceived. It's a belief. The aspirations of the two parties cannot be achieved currently, but the future is yet unwritten. So in short, conflict transformation is optimistic. It looks toward creative synthesis. And each time I begin a workshop or a mediation with parties, I think of Teilhard for that reason. And I think of the profound reality of Christian mysticism that I believe he articulates, that the boundaries or gaps or conflict I perceive between human beings, they are just that. They are perceptions obscuring a deeper reality. Teilhard describes the divine milieu as a center where all the elements of the universe touch each other. There's no separation. There, they shed in their meeting the mutual externality and the incoherences which form the basic pain of human relationships. These things are cast away. So in the divine milieu, there is Christ who consoles by gathering up everything that has been snatched from our love or has never been given to it. So God is not far away from us. As the Quran says, God is closer than our jugular vein. And so to use another key Teilhardian term, the work of conflict transformation is the work of seeing and the work of helping others to see how they too might act a creative role in that divine reality. The poet Hopkins writes, for Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. Thank you.
Beautiful, Josh. Thank you for that closing quote from Hopkins there. And the explanation too, beautifully, of how you integrate Teilhard's work into such an important ministry that you have. So next, we're going to swing it over to Sister Libby Osgood, who is an assistant professor in sustainable design of engineering at the University of Prince Edward Island. She is currently a religious sister in the Congregation of Notre Dame at Montreal. In a former life, she received degrees in aerospace engineering and has a PhD in mechanical engineering, where she eventually worked with Orbital Sciences as a systems engineer in Gilbert, Arizona, supporting the design of 2 NASA satellites. So, Sister Libby, we would love to hear about Teilhard's influence in your work and your journey.
Oh, thank you. I warn you, I get excited and speak quicker than I should. So I approach Teilhard as a spiritual seeker with scientific training. I love his work deeply, that he unabashedly crosses disciplines and speaks from an internal deep place of knowing. imagining, and wondering. As an engineer, I approach his corpus with a critical eye, weighing the parts I love and the parts that make me cringe, the parts that inspire deep spiritual thought, and the parts that bring me instantly to an ecstatic state of prayer. Teilhard offers some deep truths that linger, as well as a hope for the future. He was multifaceted, just as a diamond with separate faces. So I approached Teilhard and our talk today, examining how Teilhard, the spiritual mentor and guide, has influenced the many facets of my life. First, I am a classifier. My early exploration of Teilhard examined his use of the word nature, as he is regarded as an early ecological thinker. It turns out he uses that one word in 13 distinct definitions that can be classified into 5 different themes. I've read all of Teilhard's work twice now. First, when I was in the novitiate, I studied his essays chronologically to see how his thought evolved over time. Second, I examined his essays and letters this past year with my friend and mentor, Sister Kathleen Degnan, entirely over Zoom. And like Celia, I have to think, what would Teilhard think of that? We composed a book of hours using Teilhard's own words so that we might pray along with Teilhard, the spiritual guide. As an engineer, Teilhard gave me permission to be wrong. I try to be precise and accurate in everything, but there's a place to posit theories, to play with ideas so that others might grasp them and turn them into more. Teilhard had a close circle of friends and correspondents. He was invited to speak at geological societies, but he lacked access to the academy to debate his spiritual ideas. Thus, in his writings, he had the boldness to postulate ideas whose understandings may evolve. For example, his use of ether doesn't really align with our current scientific understanding, and his use of scientific terms from outside the field were imprecise and reaching. As Kathleen and I were working, or could be, I suppose, as Kathleen and I were working on the book and came across a passage, I'd say, that's not how engineers use that term. And we'd debate its particular merits and whether his intention was for poetry and artistry rather than accuracy. Also, Teilhard's thinking evolved over time. For example, in Vision of the Past, a letter he wrote from 1953 updates his thoughts on the essay from 1921. He wasn't afraid to let his ideas evolve. As he says in one of his most famous letters, your ideas mature gradually. Let them grow. Let them shape themselves without undue haste. So when reading his work, it's important to look at the year it was written and put that in the context of his life. Was he writing from the battlefield? Was he a young Jesuit teaching in Egypt? Was he in the middle of a dig? It could have changed what he was saying. As a professor of engineering, Teilhard teaches me to lean into the fear of being rejected by my fellow faculty, encouraging me to research more than widgets and to look beyond the walls of the engineering building for inspiration. As both a scientist and religious, Teilhard gave me permission to be both as well and truly helped me to realize my calling to religious life, allowing my love of science to influence my spirituality. He said, to tell a religious to take up science without at the same time allowing them to rethink their whole view of religion is indeed an impossible assignment. And to condemn them to producing results of no real value in an interior life that is torn in 2 ways. While I truly did feel torn in 2 ways, Teilhard helped me to understand my calling. As a young religious, Teilhard teaches me about the vow of obedience. Despite his many attempts to publish the divine milieu during his lifetime, he remained faithful to his vocation and obeyed when they said no, time and time again. However, he found the loophole and continued to write, knowing his works would be published after his death. So he was somehow both respectful to his superiors and to his inner calling. Now, one aspect of Teilhard that I do think is important to acknowledge, his language can be problematic. He speaks of people outside his race using impolite terminology. Also, despite his great friendships with women, I find his writings to and on women can be pandering or patronizing. While I acknowledge I'm reading translated, edited versions of his work, and he was a man of his time, part of his texts are out of place in today's world. So we, as Teilhardians, wish better of him and recognize the intent behind the language. It's our responsibility as researchers to bring his thinking into the 22nd century, not for today, but for tomorrow. He said, we need a new and higher form of worship to be disclosed, adapted to the needs of all of tomorrow's believers. Thus, we can interpret his work using gender-neutral, respectful, non-binary language to make his theories, his hope towards a better future, accessible to larger audiences. Just as we gently correct the language of an elder who crosses the line of family parties, so we must do for Teilhard, because his message is bigger, and we don't want it clouded or misinterpreted, and I feel it's our responsibility as devotees. Ultimately, what drew me to Teilhard is that he wasn't bound in one area. He balanced art and science, making creativity sacred in all forms. He found a way to worship while digging, helping to find evidence for evolution, an unpopular theory at the time. Teilhard gives each of us the freedom to go beyond what we perceive as our limits. He calls us to the more, to constantly bettering ourselves. He said, and this is the last quote, "Henceforth, no intellectual seeker worthy of the name can work unless in the depths of their being, they are sustained by the idea of carrying further and to its extreme limit." Thank you.
Thank you, Libby. And yes, that's one of the things that I mutually appreciate about Teilhard, is that he was just so multidimensional, is the phrase I use to describe his person, his experience, his relationships too. And part of the reason why I'm grateful for all of you sharing these wonderful perspectives. So last but not least, from our panel today, I'm curious to hear what Reverend Catherine Amy has to say. Reverend Catherine Amy Kropp is a priest in the Episcopal Diocese of Alaska after graduating from Yale Divinity School, and she has also served as a registered Maine guide and a former high school science teacher. So along her journey, she has developed a deep interest in the intersection of nature and spirituality, and currently serves as an instructor and curriculum developer for a traveling music program that connects Alaska Native elders and youth, promotes spirituality and physical wellness through music, as well as preserving Native music traditions. So talk about a multi-dimensional person. Reverend Catherine, please share Teilhard's spirit of influence in your life and work.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. It's an honor to be included in this panel and to gather in the vision and presence of Teilhard. And it is a gift to be asked this question: how has Teilhard influenced my life and my work? I think Teilhard's influence on my life began before I was conscious of it, if that makes any sense. His work represents something so big and emergent that it's rising through me like groundwater moving slowly through the earth, and it continues to evolve and move within me, and I feel myself falling in. And so in this walk with Teilhard, this has become the basis for my ministry in this sense of becoming. And it's led me to become, almost without knowing it, a practitioner of Teilhard's work. I think I would call myself a practitioner rather than a scholar or before a scholar. In my work as a priest and a pastoral care provider, as an interpreter of scripture and the gospel message, I find I am drawn into something that has practical application and relevance and urgency and in immediacy, and finding language for that and reaching for that has been part of my journey. And I find that language in Teilhard as I go back again and again to his work. And before I was ordained a priest, I was a science teacher in Maine. And even then I was yearning to bring the whole sweep of things, of science and art and pattern and beauty and the deep web of life and cosmos and mystery together. And I was discovering in Teilhard a kind of language for my spiritual hunger and a sense of becoming more together and feeling that I was part of something. And there's something about what Josh said about, how we see, how that there's practical implications for that, how perception matters and seeing radiance has implications for conflict resolution and just how we see ourselves as part of this world and responsible and embedded together. And so in this journey from science teacher, from outdoor educator to priest, and to ministry involving the cosmic dimensions of Christianity, Teilhard has been my bridge and my grounding and my touchstone. And also this sacramental worldview, especially Teilhard's Mass on the World. I remember reading that for the first time, just ecstatic for the language that he was able to bring into my heart around how, as I might quote, we make the whole earth our altar. and we offer you all the labors and sufferings of the world. We call before us the whole of living humanity, this restless multitude, this ocean of humanity. It is to this deep that we respond. And in this sense of sacramental worldview, I'm also just drawn again, how much we are called to wake up and to see ourselves and that we matter, and that the small things matter, and we can get so crushed and overwhelmed by so many things, and yet to be deeply present in that mystical sense, we can actually see that what we are doing is radiating an energy, and we are becoming conduits, and that we're doing more than we realize, and that we are needed. And so that's also where I find myself when I get stuck. And so finally, this sense of impasse that we all have, either individually when our spiritual journey finds an obstacle, or we just feel collectively in the earth a sense of great convergence, I find in Teilhard a great companion. And sometimes my spiritual experience runs deeper and broader than the church can sometimes in its present form express. And so in that deep sense of yearning and reaching, and in that sacramental worldview, I find Teilhard is guiding me into the future and how we worship and how we gather. And I also trust in the slow work of God, and I love that reflection, if you haven't read it, by Teilhard on that slow work of God and trusting in that slow work patiently. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine Amy. Very well said. And thank you for all of our panel members for your insights. It's a treat to be able to hear from emerging Teilhardians who have such a vast array of experience and backgrounds and journeys too. It seems as someone who has, in college changed majors a couple times, changed careers a few times, there is a deeper awareness of, that call beyond what the world says that doesn't make sense on a resume, perhaps. And it's a challenge to take up that call and embrace that path, and that path of constant change and persistent patient trust along that time. But something you said, Catherine, that really stood out to me was this notion. It's how you started your 5-minute piece there on how Teilhard was present in your life before you knew it. And that immediately made me think of my sophomore honors English class. My professor was someone who just always stood out to me as being an excellent teacher. And when I returned to my high school, this time as a faculty member, post-college graduation to teach, and he found out that I was doing my master's work on Teilhard and eventually my doctoral work, he said, "Andrew, do you know that I did my master's work on Teilhard?" And, there it was subliminally within those sophomore English classes, being instilled. And it's always made me wonder, the ways that I, as being a Teilhardian, pass those things on. And it's wonderful to hear, though, all those tangible ways that you are living out that spirit of fire, that spirit of evolution that burns within all of us. So I'm curious to know if you were to have to take your understanding and the importance of Teilhard's life and work, and this question goes to the whole panel, and really just to put it into a few words, like really concentrate it, really distill it, boil it down. What would that phrase or what would that sentence be? I know what I would say. This is a question that I kind of thought of today. I've heard it asked before in different ways, but I would say something to the effect of get connected, or get outside, even, is what I like to say. So I'm curious, how do you distill the depth and breadth of Teilhard's thinking, his mystic vision, his vision that is so imperative that he says we must have it or we will perish? All right, how do you distill that? I'm curious, and if you need a second to think about it, that's okay too. And whoever's ready can just jump right in.
I can jump in. I'm sure if I thought about it, I'd have a bigger answer. But what comes to mind right away for me is discovering the fire of God's love, and that's coming from Teilhard describing how one of the greatest human achievements is discovering fire, and now we are on this journey to discovering fire a second time. And when we do, it's going to be love. And when you take that and read scripture or other poetic and mystical spiritual witness, you see radiance, you see glimpses of it, you see the warming of the heart. And that's like where I find Teilhard driving me the most, is into the fire of love.
Awesome. A persistent symbol throughout Teilhard for sure. And such a quotable quote from Teilhard too about rediscovering fire for sure.
I think Catherine said it already a moment ago, perhaps some others did as well, but the idea of the sacramental view of the world captures Teilhard for me, and captures Christianity as well. But the Jesuit maxim to find God in all things would be another. I mean, Teilhard was a Jesuit, and again, I see his work deeply entrenched in Christian mysticism and his identity as a Jesuit.
Thanks, Josh.
I can kind of come in on this theme of love. Catherine, Amy, I loved when you said discover the fire of God's love, because that's what our community has picked as our tagline. And I just love it. But I think for me, it's like, can't you see love coming from the future? Just open yourself to receive it, and this will make all the difference.
I think I like to jump on to, Teilhard's great hope, and the action required with that. He said, we must devote ourselves to the task demanded of us by life as if it's a personal and sacred duty. So just that notion of constant progress, working forward and doing what must be done to achieve this, that it's not going to come easily.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Teilhard, he often speaks about how, I believe he says that faith consecrates us, but it is fidelity that brings us into communion. And there's something about the active commitment to something, Libby, that you're talking about that really highlights in that faith consecrates us, but it's fidelity, steadfastness, long-standing, long-suffering brings us into communion. So I'm curious to know, as we kind of, approach the end here of our program and our time together today, to be kind of wrapping things up and to be sending people off with some inspiration and a positive message, as this whole presentation has been today from Dr. Haught, really expounding this seemingly abstract, though we know it's quite not, through a Teilhardian lens, very concrete notion of time, and how while we're all in this beautiful song and dance together, what's something that you can leave us with that allows you to be in communion, that allows you to be in fidelity to that spirit of the divine that pulls you to greater material yet greater inner complexity and inner consciousness within your own life? What allows you to push through the suffering of evolution, the turmoil, the tension of evolution, to continue to grow and ascend?
I can start. I think for what I hear in Teilhard is we must do what is demanded of us. He said we must add one stitch, no matter how small, to the magnificent tapestry of life. And I find that can be a beat of my heart to walk towards, that we each contribute to this magnificent tapestry together. But the only way to make it beautiful is to do that one little small thing.
Excellent. Thank you, Libby.
I would add, if I had to say one thing, in addition to, just remembering that we're beloved and part of something magnificent, which is very nourishing. But I think Teilhard was so good at entering into the shadow spaces, the suffering, the darkness. And I often turn to the word grit. It's going to take some grit, which is what the faith journey is. But when we step into places of our own darkness or the world, and it's so hard, we can remember that we're not alone. And I think that's really important in a world of sort of hyper individualism, that we're not isolated, we're woven together, we are communal. And so when you are despairing, remember that someone else is there with you, communally lifting you up. And okay to feel anything you're feeling, but not to feel disconnected, and to have courage.
What does Teilhard say? Together we exist, together we suffer, together we continue to recreate each other. Something to that effect. Yeah.
I agree with all of this. I would say first off that I think young people right now, all people, but young people acutely are hungry for justice in an unjust world. This speaks to Libby's point about language as well, I think. And they're seeking hope because times are difficult right now, economically and socially and pervasively. And so what I would say is that part of the message of Teilhard for me is that love is sustaining all things, and that it's drawing us towards something more beautiful still. And so therein, I think, lies hope, and therein lies something we very much need.
I would echo everything that's been said. For me, it's, I think, living into those spaces of love, focusing on Christ and on the Christification that's taking place, seeing it in this larger sphere of becoming, of awakening, and hold on to the hope that Teilhard holds out to us, that what we do matters in bringing this new creation about.
Thank you all for these wonderful perspectives. And like I said before, in terms of time being concrete, your time here in terms of on the Zoom call today is, we are very grateful for it, but the work you're doing as you gave testimony today, that work is very concrete in time in the world. So thank you for that wonderful work. And I hope that, your words today have been inspiring to those, as I hope they've been. I know they've been for me as someone who, when I read Teilhard, so much of it is intuitive. So much of it is just speaking to my heart and whatever my mind can process of those words that he is speaking. But, when I engage with other Teilhardians, when I engage with other humans that just, can speak of the tapestry of human experience, it's something that, can give more flesh to those concepts, which maybe spark our mind when we read Teilhard that we don't quite understand. But in that lived human experience, the active engagement, the work, doing the work, the activity, as Libby said, entering into the dark spaces, as Catherine said, the psychoanalyst Carl Jung writes that the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure that you seek to find, right? And it is only by embracing the whole of human experience in that way, which inevitably extends beyond my individual experience, right? As Jack said, in terms of moving beyond just that sense of being to a sense of loving, to eventually a sense of adoration, where we're doing this together communally, right? And today has just been such a wonderful testament to that, both our panel, our whole program, all the work that went into putting it together. So I would like to just give a big virtual round of applause here to all the good people that did hard work, and especially those on the panel. And thanks so much to the person who really makes this whole thing possible, keeps our whole organization moving, Sister Kathy. So I am now going to unspotlight our panelists, and I'm going to turn the stage back over to Kathy here.
Well, all I can say is thank you, thank you, thank you. First of all, for a wonderful talk by my good friend, Jack Haught. It was exactly what I was hoping to hear, and I thought it was really fine. And you kept into the minutes that I gave you, which was really helpful, which had to be extremely difficult. And the members of my reading circle, as I said, are going to be very happy with, with a little bit more information that you gave, making it clearer and clearer for us as we continue. And I would encourage everybody here to go out and buy that book and read it if you haven't already done that. God After Einstein. It's very interesting, and with a topic like that, you really probably need to read it a couple times to really get to the bottom of it. But I would also like to thank Andrew Del Rossi for moderating the session, and then specifically this amazing group of recent scholars. I think that what you've shared with us is just phenomenal, and it makes me so hopeful for the future. Talk about hope for the future, to see that younger people who are just beginning their careers, are really interested in Teilhard, and they can bring his vision forward. They can see what is of value and do that. And so to Celia, to Josh, to Catherine Mary, and Libby, thank you for sharing the impact of Teilhard's vision on your life and work in so many ways today. And to all those who organized the meeting, it's never a small task. And I'm always grateful for our board members who pitch in when we need them to. So thank you very much. And then finally, a warm thank you to all of you for taking time from your busy schedules on this beautiful, it's very hot here, but still it's a beautiful Saturday afternoon. And so we are grateful for that you came and that you stayed, and we hope to see you all again soon. So please stay in touch. Thank you.